It's worth bearing in mind that I think 28% of development aid in the last fiscal year was spent on migrant hotels in the UK.
We will emit no more than 535 million tonnes of CO2 over the period between 2038 and 2042. 540, utterly unacceptable. If you believe that's what we should be doing, you're a climate criminal.
President Trump does often give the impression that he just thinks interest rates should always be lower. You hear this in this country where people say, well, you can't say that, that's a matter for the Bank of England. It's like, no, these are very legitimate areas of economic debate, and politicians should have views on these.
Hello and welcome to the Institute of Economic Affairs podcast. I'm Callum Price. Today I'm joined by our Chief Operating Officer and Energy Analyst Andy Mayer and our Executive Director Tom Clougherty. Now there's much to get into this week, but before we do, I want to remind you to go and sign up to our Substack at insider.iea.org.uk. There you can get all of our blogs, publications, podcasts straight to your inbox, and it's free to sign up. Though paid subscribers do get extra content and exclusive invitations to our events as well. So today, gentlemen, we have on the agenda carbon budgets, we have central bank independence, but first I want to talk about defence, because defence this week has been once again rising up the agenda on the international stage, and the government has made a significant announcement to increase defence spending. So beforehand, where they've been waiting to see what we're going to get to 2.5% of GDP eventually, they've now set out a timeline. So they're at 2.3% now. 2.5% is the target by 2027, and then by 2034 they're going to get to 3% of defence spending. They're going to fund this, they say, by cutting the overseas development aid budget from 0.5% of GDP to 0.3% of GDP, considering, remember, it's already come down from 0.7. And I think this is an interesting topic for a number of reasons. Firstly, because it is an area where I think even classical liberals and those who believe in a small state can agree largely that defence is a public good that should be funded through taxation. It is a role of the state that we should be doing and doing properly, especially as the world is feeling increasingly unstable. But there's also a question about the role of overseas development aid and also a more macro question about the role of percentage spending targets. One of the interesting things in this, I mean, there's been some number chicanery from the government anyway. They say it's going to be a £13 billion rise when actually it's a £6 billion rise, unless you're measuring against a world which wouldn't happen, where they just suddenly have frozen defence budgets, which was never on the agenda. But more importantly, you target defence spending by percentage of GDP as they are. But one of the things they've done, for example, is say, well, we're going to include security and intelligence spending as part of that, which is not unreasonable, right? But suddenly, without changing any of the actually diverting any resources, then the amount of, you're closer to the target that you've set. Are, therefore, percentage GDP spending targets or ring-fence budgets in a broader sense, are they all just smoke and mirrors?
Yes. There we go. Topic done. No, so I think percentage of GDP targets, I mean, obviously they're useful as a signalling device. There's obviously a kind of element of collective security and the commitment of different countries to spend percentages of GDP as part of a NATO commitment or an agreement with the Americans. And I guess it would be a lot harder to specify in cash terms what every country should be spending to keep up their end of the alliance. So, you know, I sort of get that, but I also think from the UK perspective, this isn't really the right way to think about how we spend money on anything. Now, I don't know an awful lot about defence, not an area I've ever really delved into in great detail. But if people tell me we need to be spending more on defence, then, okay, well, I'll agree with that. But I want to see why, and I want to see how the expenditure is justified. What I don't want is to say we have to spend this amount, and then everyone is scrambling around to try and spend that amount without spending it in precisely the right way. For me, on the defence side of this, the question is, what actually do we need the British military and our defence and security and intelligence services to provide? What are the real threats, and what level of spending is commensurate with meeting them? And I think probably, and again, this is sort of straying outside classic IEA territory, but I think probably that requires a degree of modesty about the kind of power that Britain is. And I do think there's a tendency maybe to waste money in a kind of post-imperial delusion that we are a world power that should be projecting our authority across the globe. I'm not sure that that's realistic or desirable. And while, yes, I mean, I strongly agree that defence is a legitimate function of the state and probably has to be funded out of taxation and it's public good, as you say, that doesn't justify any and all defence spending. And it doesn't necessarily justify, more interventionist or aggressive approaches to foreign policy and military policy. Now, I'm not trying to make an argument one way or the other there, simply to say that it's a more complicated question than simply 3% of GDP is the right amount to spend, and let's make sure we spend it.
Yeah, quite. So we'd rather be seeing how much more money you're going to spend on defence and on what and why, rather than just hitting this target. And we can't ignore the timing of this announcement. 2 days before the Prime Minister goes to the States to speak to the President and get him on side. And so it is largely a signalling device, do you think, Ang?
Well, let's start from first principles. So the fundamental duty of the government, whether you are a libertarian or a socialist, is security of the realm. And with Russia newly aggressive in Europe for the Ukrainians since 2014 and for the rest of us since the 2020s, very clearly we are collectively facing a threat. And that threat is rising, and it is now rising existentially because the position of the new US administration, which historically has always been to provide that shelter and umbrella for Europe, has reversed, and Trump seems more aligned with the ambitions of Vladimir Putin than he does with Volodymyr Zelensky and all of the other states that have borders with Russia or in their near orbit. So our role historically, even before empire and during empire, was to try and maintain the peace in Europe. They called us perfidious Albion because of the way we stirred between nations, but generally with the aim of peace rather than conquest. And that remains our mission today. We need to ensure that there is a collective response to Russian aggression, that their borders do not keep salami slicing their way forward towards ours. And underlying it in our self-interest, which we'll come on to later, is obviously the energy question and the deeply damaging effect it's had on energy prices as a result of our own bad decisions over previous decades. So it's really quite important that we do this. And I agree with everything else Tom said about the quality of defence spending. Now, the key question is always, why is the British Armed Services so bad at procurement? Historically, they have wasted billions on bad make-it-here projects that mean the British Army, the Air Force, the Navy end up with subpar kit. Now, a free market or a classical liberal response is much more about how do you make the best of the private sector and our friends and allies to get the best possible security solutions for the forces that we do need to deploy. And to give you an example, when we were looking at flights to help people get out of difficult places like Afghanistan, the difference between the cost suggested for each flight to rescue people by the British government was about £1 million. The private sector could do it for £10,000. Now, clearly there's going to be wiggle room in there somewhere, but if that's the kind of difference that we're talking about, we can make sure that every single pound of that GDP target is spent more effectively if we're using a wider variety of inputs into our security system.
That's a really interesting point, and I'd like to take two of those points, the sort of the bang for our buck, if you like, and also the self-interest point, and look at the other side of this announcement, which is the cut in development aid. So we've already cut from 0.7 to 0.5%, and now we're going to cut again from 0.5 to 0.3. Now, the IEA has written about foreign aid recently, and made the point that we shouldn't be giving foreign aid to areas that have a higher regional GDP per capita than many places in the UK, which is a reasonable suggestion to make, I think. When you're giving money to places in China that are sort of about as rich as Swansea, then maybe that's not well spent. But is there an argument that there's a self-interest point for the UK to be ensuring that other places in the world are happier, healthier, and safer to stop migration numbers that we can't handle, or pandemics, or anything else? Are we sort of shooting ourselves in the foot by cutting development aid, do you think?
I don't think so. I think that there is in some elements of overseas development aid some aspects of it, there is that self-interest that you point to. It's worth bearing in mind that I think 28% of development aid in the last fiscal year was spent on migrant hotels in the UK. That's about £4 billion. So that's effectively equivalent to two-thirds of the money that the Prime Minister is going to divert from aid towards defence. I would guess, given that we haven't sort of stopped the channel crossings and so on, that we will keep paying for hotels.
And probably more as well.
And probably more. And so I do think that's the interesting question, with development aid already having been cut, with so much of it being diverted to something that doesn't really look like development aid to a lot of people. I understand that we spend some of our development aid overseas in trying to keep refugees where they are, rather than them becoming asylum seekers into the UK. So I do wonder what there is that they're going to have to cut. And in particular, how the politics of that are going to go for a centre-left government. And it does seem interesting to me that this is one of those right-coded things, cutting development aid, putting more money into defence, that I don't think a centre-right government could ever have done, or at least they wouldn't have felt they could do it. I'm sure, like me, you heard Conservatives complain bitterly over and over again about how much money was being wasted on international development aid while they were in government, while it was their own commitment. And then in the same breath say, but we couldn't possibly row back from that. They eventually did after the pandemic in very straitened fiscal circumstances. But now the Labour government has gone further. So I think that's an interesting aspect of it as well. Look, I think this is probably the right kind of mix, to spend less on development aid, to spend a bit more on defence. And I think it goes in hand with that self-interest idea that you pointed out. But I do think, to go back to the original point, this whole idea of setting spending by percentages of GDP, by creating targets, is an iffy one. And I actually think back to when... So aid spending is going to go back to about where it was before 2010. So before the coalition government came in. And I remember one of the complaints that people in development aid were making, development economists were making at the time, at least the more free market inclined ones, was that although development aid historically has had quite a bad reputation among free market economists, and often a sense that the money is wasted, or that it sort of props up corrupt regimes and helps them to line their own pockets and so on. What they said was, actually, Britain's aid was really well run, and they had developed, good methods of control and making sure that it was being spent on important humanitarian interventions, health and stuff like that. One of the problems was when there was suddenly this target to go from spending 0.3% of GDP to, in short order, spending 0.7% of GDP, money was just being sloshed everywhere, and the quality of the development aid declined quite significantly. Now, many of the same people would say that they found their way back. And over time, they managed to impose good controls over the increased amount of development aid they were spending. Many of us, myself included, still sort of question spending that much on overseas aid when we have a big fiscal deficit of our own in Britain. My concern would be, are we going to end up doing the same thing on defence if we're trying to increase it actually by much more than we increased development spending?
So if I just come in, again, going back to first principles, the conceit of state-funded international aid is that we, the government, know how to spend your money better than you do on good causes and things that you value in the wider world. And I think the government has a point in that when it comes to emergency and disaster relief, although some of the donation figures that sometimes have to be given back in the disasters that you see in the media may suggest otherwise. So few people argue with the case for international aid when we can see earthquakes devastating a region or a famine, and things like the Live Aid experience that came out of the back of that in the 1980s, for example. But where it gets more and more dodgy and looks just like regular government waste is when we try and virtue signal in the world, where we're projecting British values into other countries and saying we can send somebody out here from an aid agency or a related NGO funded by the state, and they're going to create the Ethiopian version of the Spice Girls, which is one of the famous cases that led to this debate. And that clearly looks like waste.
Yeah.
And if what the Labour government are doing is dragging the aid budget back to those core, extremely valuable, urgent and imperative things, I don't think many people are going to protest. But you said it yourself, the major rise in aid spending came during the Conservative, Liberal Democrat and then Conservative administrations. And here, one of the major failings of Conservatives is the idea that politics is simply about who the better managers are. And they saw themselves as virtuous people who could better spend this money on our behalf. And they're simply wrong. We need to get back to a situation where the government is doing as little as possible extremely well.
I'd like to raise the very important topic of pensions. Yes. In connection with this. It may be in a slightly broader sense. But first of all, I'm sure I read some time ago, although I haven't confirmed this, that we include pension costs of ex-servicemen in our defence spending.
Yeah, that's right.
And that will presumably be a rising chunk over time with an ageing population and a relatively smaller military compared with the past. So that's another thing, a bit like putting migrant hotels in the international development statistics, lies, damn lies and statistics. There's that cliche for you. The other thing that I think is worth considering here is that, defence spending declined after the Second World War. It declined a lot since the end of the Cold War, and there was a sort of a peace dividend, so to speak. But rather than that resulting in smaller government and lower taxes, it's actually been recycled into and then completely outstripped by an increase in social welfare spending, so healthcare, pensions, etc. And that is going to go into overdrive as our population ages, and there's no sign of that changing. And so I think this is an important thing to think about. Okay, yes, you can find 6 billion in the aid budget and put it towards defence. If we're really talking about going back towards Cold War levels of defence expenditure, how is that going to sit in the context of an ever-growing welfare state? And perhaps if we are reconsidering our priorities in terms of spending, that's somewhere else that we need to look quite seriously. Because frankly, we can't spend an extra 10% of GDP on people over the age of 65 or 70, whatever it is, over the next 50 years, and spend more on defence and spend more on all of the other priorities. There are trade-offs, and obviously the government has acknowledged that in a limited way and with a little bit of fiscal sleight of hand when it comes to overseas development aid. But there are much larger questions about trade-offs and the things that government can do. And I think we've talked about it on this podcast before with our colleague Steve Davies, that you have this weird situation where government has grown and grown and grown. It's tried to do more and more and more things, but it increasingly does them all badly, and it particularly badly does the things that you think of as classical liberals as the core functions of the state. So the police are under-resourced, we don't have enough prisons, the court system has ground to a halt, apparently we're not spending enough on defence in light of Russian aggression in Europe, and so on.
Yeah.
So there's a real question of priorities here.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right, and could basically be brought into every single topic about government spending anywhere, defence or wherever else, that we are staring down the barrel of these unfunded liabilities in a way that we have never done in our history. And you're right, the conversation still can quite, in a sort of retail sense, can quite often rely on how we used to do things. But you're right to point out that, well, when we used to do things during the Cold War or during World War II or whatever, there is the state looked drastically different to how it looks today. But from one existential crisis in defence to another, Andy, the Climate Change Committee published its 7th carbon budget this week. You are our energy analyst and expert. Could you start by just explaining what in the world a carbon budget is and what's it for?
So I'm not sure the audience is going to be any more enlightened by the time I've stopped talking about this. We must start. They're incredibly nebulous things. So, back in the day when young Ed Miliband was merely a very optimistic and ideological minister in the Labour government under Tony Blair and then Gordon Brown, he conceived of the Climate Change Act. And the Climate Change Act created the then Committee on Climate Change, which is now the Climate Change Committee. And one of its powers was to advise the government on carbon budgets. And carbon budgets, with no ironical nod to the Soviet Union and their 5-year plans, are 5-year plans for the amount of carbon that can be emitted by the UK if we are to be on track to hit our targets, which are now net zero by 2050. And the document that's produced, it's very long, very well researched. It's effectively a scenario plan. It's saying under the following circumstances, and the balanced pathway is their preferred pathway, we will emit no more than 535 million tonnes of CO2 over the period between 2038 and 2042. 540, utterly unacceptable. If you believe that's what we should be doing, you're a climate criminal. Much below that, fantasy. This is 535 or about 100 a year is going to be where we land. Now, the conceit of carbon budgets is the idea that anybody can predict anything on that scale that far in advance. I mean, we live in the world of the price mechanism, and we know that it's quite hard to predict prices next week, let alone 5 years in advance, let alone 12 years in advance, which is the rough time scale that you get from a carbon budget. It's a sense of heads up, this is what's going to happen. So they make a lot of assumptions, and a lot of the criticisms that you'll see of the carbon budgets over the course of the next few weeks will be people who are either pro or anti the sorts of things they're recommending, drilling into that data and coming up with very good analysis as to what they've got right and wrong. But in reality, none of it is right. It's just guesswork. So we don't know what the cost of offshore wind, for example, will be in 2040. We don't know what the cost of oil and gas will be. We don't know what the trade-offs costs will be that will be required if we divert national resources into funding decarbonisation rather than, say, defence or international aid. So what we end up with is a beautiful vision of the future, which is then presented to Parliament, and by, I think it's the 30th of June 2026, Ed Miliband will have to say what the government is doing. Firstly, to agree that budget, then say what the government is doing to actually meet it. Now, what any government minister says about what the government is doing to meet a target 12 year hence is for the birds. I mean, there are long timescales in energy. It does take a very long time, for example, to get a nuclear power station built in this country. But if you're focusing on saying we are going to precisely deploy a 6-fold increase in the number of offshore wind turbines, a doubling of onshore, maybe a bit of hydrogen, some nuclear power stations, it's missing the point. The ruthless focus of anybody who is serious about decarbonisation should be economic growth. From economic growth, making energy cheaper and more affordable, you then get both the ability to deploy more of it, and secondly, things that can then be invested in new technology and solutions, either through the private sector or, if you're on the left, through some kind of government support.
So the carbon budget or carbon budgets generally are basically you joked about the sort of 5-year plan, but I mean that's literally what it is. It's a Leviathan act of central planning. And I was just flicking through, and one part of it included predicting how many sheep and cows we'd need sort of over the course of the next 50 years. I mean, that's just high exporting in its grave, is it?
Because meat consumption is going to fall by 25%, apparently.
Yeah.
And 80% of cars will be electric, sure. And loads of trucks will be electric, even though basically electric trucks for haulage don't really exist at this point in time. Right. And if they do, they can only go 100 miles. I mean, I think a lot of the assumptions are fantastical, and a lot of it reads extraordinarily prescriptive. Now, it's worth saying, I mean, this is an advisory committee, so the government will ultimately decide, do they agree with this budget, do they not? I think the thing that's really pernicious is that the government has to come up with first with the carbon budget, and then with a detailed plan for how they're going to hit that carbon budget. And if that plan is insufficiently convincing, then they can be sued by all of the activist groups or, judicially reviewed. And that basically biases our entire approach to energy policy towards central planning and towards top-down control. And indeed, I think towards relying on probably the things you know about, like the kind of established technologies. It kind of rules out a lot of innovation, because I think if you're approaching this as a free market person, and Andy rightly referenced the price system, let's say that you want to decarbonise. The best way to do that is by setting a carbon price and pricing in the externalities, and using that to drive behavioural change and using that to drive innovation. And the great thing is you don't know what's going to happen as a result of that carbon price. And that's the whole point, because you are letting the solutions be market-led in that scenario. And in theory, now I'm not endorsing this, but in theory you could manipulate that carbon price however you wanted to encourage faster decarbonisation, slower decarbonisation, etc. The crucial thing is you are letting the private sector innovate. You are being technology neutral. You're not having to make these very complicated assumptions about how many cows and chickens we'll eat in 12 years' time. And you're not also, you're not having to sort of be prescriptive about how much energy overall will we use. You don't have to get into this demand suppression stuff. You can just say, well, we're going to set a price and people can decide. They can make their own trade-offs. Do they want to pay for the energy? Do they want to change their behaviour, etc., etc.? Now, I know there are deeper questions about how much do we want to decarbonise, how quickly, how appropriate is it for government to be involved in this business? And I think people can reasonably disagree about that. But if you want to decarbonise, I think you can do it. And the best way to do it is through the price system. And the Climate Change Committee and the whole system of carbon budgets and delivery plans mitigates against that so strongly. It forces us down a road of central planning, industrial policy, etc., which I think is almost doomed to failure, doomed to expensive failure. And no one benefits from that.
Is there... The role of the CCC is obviously sort of, it's been set up as an external expert agency that advises the government, but in previous years it's been criticised. Well, the CCC hasn't been criticised necessarily, but the process has been criticised from maybe people like us who have said, well, it's been somewhat, their advice is somewhat rubber stamp. Sitting in the government department, if the CCC, you build up the CCC to be such an expert non-political body that it's almost untouchable. You just sort of have to do what it says. Although maybe there's a slight vibe shift coming or happening that means, do you think that this budget, Andy, will be more scrutinised and more viewed on with more sceptical eye than previous ones?
Well, the CCC themselves say that this is a much less prescriptive budget than the previous six. And the approach under previous leadership has been quite directive, with hundreds of different micro initiatives recommended for policy. We get the ban on internal combustion engines, for example, and gas boilers as a result of advice given by the CCC. The net zero target comes out of advice given by the CCC. So maybe they're learning. But it doesn't change any of the fundamental criticisms that this is, as Tom says, a agency designed to encourage central planning and industrial policy. What they could do, what they could be changed to under statute, is a much drier regulatory agency, which simply looks both at emissions, and they do aggregate the emissions data, and also carbon prices, both ones that are direct, such as things like fuel duty and the taxes that we put on the North Sea and the UK emissions trading scheme, and indirect, so the consequences of policies, for example, designed to bail out the steel industry, or the consequences of policies that try to make it more expensive to park in certain council areas if your car is big. Those are the kind of things they could do. And then they could also look at carbon pricing across the world and say, actually, roughly the implied carbon price in the UK is something like £40 to £60 per tonne of CO2, whereas in Germany it's higher and in China it's much lower, and therefore we are facing competitive disadvantage to China and advantage to Germany. And then Parliament could decide whether the carbon price is too high or too low and use it as a lever in order to encourage trade.
What hope do you have that the Climate Change Committee will be reformed to take on a role like that? Even the Institute for Government was welcoming the fact that there's going to be more debate and scrutiny over this budget. So is there going to be a move for the role of the organisation, do you think? Or?
I think under Ed Miliband it's very unlikely because this is his baby and he's bought wholesale into the idea that you can deliver a centrally planned solution to climate change. Whether Ed Miliband is still in his current role over the course of the Parliament, given the increasing number of clashes he's having, particularly with Rachel Reeves, over the growth agenda and the growth mission that is equally important to this government, hard to say. But that pressure is definitely building. And there has always been within Labour a environmentalist tinge that is more favourable to market solutions, and that was certainly evident under Blair.
Now, moving to our third and final topic, and over the pond, but not unlinked to the debate around the CCC. Tom, the Democrats have demanded that that Trump's nomination for one of his more senior economic advisors distances himself from previous comments about repealing the independence of the central bank. Tell us what's happening and why.
Yeah, so this was a story that caught my eye in the Financial Times on Monday. And as you say, Senator Elizabeth Warren has asked this guy, Stephen Moran, an economist, former Treasury official, and he's been affiliated with the Manhattan Institute in New York, has asked him to commit to supporting the Federal Reserve's independence from political influence. And Moran is Trump's nominee to be the chairman of the White House Council of Economic Advisors. And, I think there's a legitimate interest here because President Trump does often give the impression that he just thinks interest rates should always be lower. And he'd prefer that to support, the economy and run it hot and everything. And there have been signs that he sort of wants to put pressure on the Fed to cut interest rates faster and all that kind of thing. Now, it may actually be right to cut interest rates faster than they should be, but I think that Trump's sort of always lower setting is definitely bad economics. So I do worry about that. But I guess kind of the reason I thought this would be an interesting thing to discuss is that the FT referenced a paper that Stephen Moran and his co-author Dan Katz had written for the Manhattan Institute, suggesting that it was kind of an assault on central bank independence. And I had a look at that paper, and it was really nothing of the sort. Possibly he's made some spicier comments about Federal Reserve independence in the past, but I really don't get that impression. I mean, I think he and his co-author were making the fairly straightforward point that independence isn't absolute. And it was never intended to be absolute. The Federal Reserve is a creation of government. There should be some degree of democratic oversight. In particular, what independence the Federal Reserve or any other independent agency has should be within a framework that is defined by law. Now, I didn't actually agree with the proposals that he and his co-author were making in this paper necessarily, and it was about changing the length of the terms of the Federal Reserve governors and changing the way that people are appointed and giving state governors in the US a greater role, etc., etc. Not particularly germane to our discussion here, but I think when we talk about central banks in particular, there is this sense, and maybe you get it with the Climate Change Committee as well, that rather than simply outsourcing some kind of expert judgment, politicians have tried to outsource any kind of thinking about the topic whatsoever. And you hear this in this country where people say, well, you can't say that, that's a matter for the Bank of England. It's like, no, these are very legitimate areas of economic debate, and politicians should have views on these. If they don't have views on them, it's a sad indication that they don't understand or they don't care about really important economic issues. And I guess the main thing I would say here is that I think central banks should be operationally independent and they should be free from day-to-day political influence. I don't think you want elected politicians saying cut interest rates to give the economy a bit of a boost because we've got an election coming up or something. But I also think they should be a great deal less independent in terms of the framework that surrounds them and guides their decisions. And I mean that in a very particular way. There's been very interesting research in the US that suggests that a central bank which almost mechanically follows a rule for determining monetary policy and their decisions, over time significantly outperforms one that relies on its expert in-the-moment judgment. And so, for example, if you say that the Federal Reserve or the Bank of England or the ECB or whoever should be bound to target 3% a year or 4% a year nominal GDP growth. And they should make their decisions based on that, probably in a forward-looking way. The argument is that that is much better, delivers much better policy decisions than just saying, you guys are experts, try and keep inflation under control and employment high, and, do it how you think best.
Yeah. So, do you think just to sort of apply it to a different fields, do you think there's a sort of parallel? Because if you think about all of the institutions that a government interacts with, or there's part of the state, but not necessarily jobs of ministers, so judges, police, Climate Change Committee, and various ever-growing fields bodies. Do you think there's a sort of, I guess, line, isn't there, between things that should probably be completely independent of government and political influence always? That's probably where judges sit. And then there's things that ministers should just have complete control over, and there's a sort of spectrum in between there. And I saw in a world I understand fairly well is so the police operate sort of in the middle of that, I would say, in that you don't have politicians and should never have politicians saying arrest this man, and they don't have any say in the day-to-day running, but they can sort of set the priorities for the police, and they can change those priorities if they want. Do you think there should be more then power for? So you talk about normal GDP targeting. The Bank of England obviously targets a certain level of inflation. Do you think there should be more control for the elected government to say, actually, no, here's your target now, and move those more? Would that
yes, yeah. Basically, I think this and that's why I think this is an interesting topic, because we've had such enormous growth of unelected power over the last 40 years or whatever. Britain has developed a vast, complex, labyrinthine regulatory state that no one really planned and no one fully understands. And I think in many respects it imposes significant constraints on economic growth and so on. But I think the problem often is that you start off with a very narrow technical mandate for an independent regulator, and it may have been setting the price cap for newly privatized utility companies, for example. And then over time, you give these independent agencies or semi-independent agencies more and more responsibilities. So they have social objectives, they have environmental objectives, you layer things on top of the other. And what you're actually doing is outsourcing a whole load of policy making to an unelected and unaccountable body, which then does what bureaucracies and government institutions do. They empire build, they mission creep, and they grow. And, the famous quote, there's nothing so permanent as a temporary government program, I think is relevant here, because when you think about the regulators, the economic regulators that we set up during the privatization process in this country, the idea was that they would focus narrowly on the economic mandate of introducing greater competition, and that they would gradually wither away and die because the markets would become competitive, and competition is a better regulator and a better servant of the consumer interest than government oversight ever will be, frankly. But that never happened. It was probably quite predictable that it would never happen, and that rather than withering away, we've had a massive proliferation of different quangos, agencies, regulators, and everything else. And they are, to a degree, out of control. Or if not fully out of control, they are at least running along their own track without anyone really paying close attention to them too much of the time.
And it becomes a political problem as well for the ministers, because the government gets the stick for the decisions that are made not really by them, that are by regulators or by quangos and independent, so-called independent bodies. They will make a bad decision that ruins things, and then the government, it'll be the minister who's on the hook having to defend it to the media the next day. Yeah. I can see it happening in another field with the football regulator. Now that the government has decided it wants to regulate football, as soon as there's something else goes wrong in the Premier League or whatever, I can see the minister having to stand up and say, well, actually, people calling on the minister to do something. Well, you regulate football now, so why aren't you doing this? Well, actually, we don't. Well, we do regulate football, but it's not really me. And you sort of there's a democratic accountability problem there, isn't there?
It's two-track, isn't it? I mean, I totally agree with the point about simple rules guiding good regulation leads to better regulation, and that can obviously be applied in the context of a central bank. It becomes more difficult with the nuanced regulators, like, for example, the Electoral Commission. Now, there all would have to be something like their job is to uphold free and fair elections. But even within that nebulous concept, there is an enormous scope for mission creep and the fundamental principle of public choice economics. So that is exactly what a bureaucracy is going to do once you give it the power to do so. So the second wing of that needs to be a simple guiding principle for the governance of the regulator, which is the job of the minister. So the job of the minister with oversight for the running of the Electoral Commission must be to hold their feet in the fire on that principle of free and fair elections. Now, if both partners to that relationship have that, then you've got a check and balance, which may encourage sticking to the narrow scope of the regulation as originally designed.
Yeah, I mean, it's worth saying, going back to Stephen Moran and where we started with his paper on reforming the governance of the Federal Reserve. One of the points he makes is that there's a need for greater democratic oversight because the Fed has experienced such mission creep. And rather than simply setting monetary policy in a very technical way, they've strayed into credit allocation since the financial crisis. They've taken on a lot of regulatory responsibilities. They've taken a big role in government debt management. I mean, indeed, we all know that during the pandemic, you basically had monetary financing on both sides of the Atlantic. It wasn't technically monetary financing, but it's a fine line. And I think Dominic Cummings has said this, that basically the Bank of England was going to buy whatever debt the government issued so that we could keep going even if the economy ground to a halt and no tax revenue was coming in. Now, these are inherently political decisions. They couldn't be more political. This is kind of almost the fundamental essence of politics when you're talking about fiscal power like that. And so I think to put that in the hands of an independent agency is wrong. And I think to then fall into this trap, which many people, and I think it's particularly on the left, but not exclusively on the left, of saying, well, they have some sort of sacred status now. Whether it's the OBR, whether it's the Bank of England, whether it's the Federal Reserve, whether it's the Climate Change Committee, I think we could probably list off all sorts of different independent agencies which have probably got too big for their boots, which have strayed into political issues that they should have stayed out of. And that is something that really does need cutting down to size. So if we're doing a little bit of Millet-esque afuera, I probably pronounced that horribly, that's one of the things that I think we need to start looking at.
Indeed. And we'll add it to the list. That is all we've got time for, I'm afraid, but thank you for joining us. As mentioned, get more from the IEA on our Substack, insider.iea.org.uk. And as always, we'll be back next week. But until then, thank you very much.